Good morning and welcome to the second annual symposium of our Firearm Safety Among Children and Teens Consortium. I'm Rebecca Cunningham, the Vice President for Research and a Professor of Emergency Medicine and Health Behavior and Health Education here at the University of Michigan. As an emergency medicine physician and academic researcher, I've devoted more than 20 years of my career to exploring the issue of gun violence and its detrimental impact on our society. There was a time when very few researchers focused on this critical issue, and I'm tremendously excited that more than 300 people are scheduled to join us virtually today to learn more about the science of firearm injury prevention. I'm even more thrilled that many of you were here last year and are now back presenting your science even in these difficult times and in these weird formats. Together, we will build this field. Before we proceed, I want to remind everyone that this session is being recorded and that you will see a live transcript at the bottom of your screen. If you need to hide it, you can do so by clicking on the transcript icon. We've disabled the chat feature, but for this session, we won't be taking questions. However, for future sessions, you'll be able to use the Q&A features in all of the next sessions. If you run into any technical issues, which we're all familiar with at this point, we first ask for your grace. And second of all, please email the fax team at umich.edu so that we would be able to assist you. I want to start today's symposium by recognizing the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, who funds FACS. Just 2 years ago, the NICHD awarded $5 million to the University of Michigan to lead what is now known as the FACS Consortium with partners all over the country. At that time, it was the largest NIH funding commitment to reduce firearm injury over the prior 2 decades. I just cannot be more delighted to say that since the funding of our FACS Consortium, we have funded 9 research pilot projects to grow the field, including a national survey of parents and teens focused on firearm safety and behaviors that was in the field this spring, and a study of extreme risk protection orders across multiple states, an adoption of safe storage interventions, and several others, all of which are on our website for you to see. Several of our pilots have formed the basis for recently funded R01s. As you know, access to data is critical to supporting our research and finding a path forward. And so we've also invested in building a repository of data relevant to child firearm injury. Our data repository is at childfirearmsafety.org and has over 100 data sets that are freely available for download and analysis for secondary examination by all of you. The opportunity that we have to network and share science today as part of our second annual FACS Symposium is an outgrowth of NICHD's investment in our consortium and in firearm research and a path forward towards this public health problem. The accomplishment of FACS in 2 years suggests what's possible when we commit to funding firearm research. I'm pleased to say that since 2018, research funding to study firearm injury prevention has slowly began to creep up. In December 2019, Congress approved funding legislation that for the first time in 20 years included money to fund gun violence research. This included $25 million with the CDC and NIH, and we continue to work hard to ensure that this is just the beginning of federal investments of this major public health challenge. Indeed, today is particularly historic because today the CDC has announced the funding of their 18 grants that came from that money. It is up on the CDC's website, 16 R01s from the CDC. This is amazing. 2 KO1s to grow the fields. The grants funded are now on their website. I encourage everyone to review these, rejoice with us, join those teams, follow them, and see where the data can lead us towards solving the issues over time. The momentum here is now undeniable. This is a testament to the expertise of our talented researchers across the country, many of whom are joining us virtually today. Firearm violence is a public health crisis that's not going away, even among this rapidly changing global pandemic. I'm confident that our growing community of researchers will play a critical role in addressing the root causes of and the potential solutions for firearm injury. I'd be remiss to not mention in this past summer, our country has taken to the streets to protest the systemic racism that's plagued our country. We as firearm researchers know well that health disparities in our area have existed for years. And firearms have been the leading cause of death for Black children for decades. And for this, we must continue to pay attention and focus our attention. Today, some of the leading experts in our field will share emergent findings, data, and innovations that all aim to address a variety of important issues related to firearm injury. Today's research presentations include racial disparities in police shootings, extreme risk protection orders, or ERPOs, COVID-19 trends, what has COVID meant to firearm violence? We'll learn together today for what we begin to know, healthcare provider counseling. And in these most difficult and complicated times that I have lived through, I also want to note how much I miss seeing you all in person today. Some of us were reminiscing about the conference that we had last year and the importance of our human connection in talking to each other and building the field together and in person. And we can't do that today, but we're gripped by this pandemic, and in future years, we will hope to see each other in person and build the field that way. Today, perhaps because of the increased tensions and the challenges the pandemic brings, from increased family stress to civil unrest, our work in firearm prevention research is now more relevant than ever. And I appreciate the critical role you're all playing to help us define the next directions for this important field, bringing your science forward and discussing it today. So I want to move on now today and note that support from our leadership is incredibly important if we're going to move forward in this space. Support from the NIH and CDC, federal leadership, as well as local leadership. And I'm so pleased to introduce the University of Michigan President, Mark Schlissel. President Schlissel has been an ardent supporter of firearm injury prevention research, and last October, he announced a new campus-wide initiative that encourages and coordinates research across disciplines to develop new knowledge on data and gun violence here at the University of Michigan. I'll ask our tech folks here if you can now please share his video.
Thank you, Vice President Cunningham, for the kind introduction, but more importantly, for your work to address this important public health crisis through science, research, and data-driven solutions. Thank you all for attending this crucial symposium, but particularly thanks to the members of the FACTS Consortium. I wish I could be there to address you live, but COVID-19 and my schedule has gotten in the way. I'd like to express my appreciation to all attendees for directing their work at this significant public health problem. This is a fantastic example for the type of contribution that the Academy can make and lead to important problems of the day. Your focus and talents are providing hope to millions in communities all across the nation by adding to the science and data we're now marshaling to save lives and prevent harm. I also want to thank our partners in government. This conference is sponsored by the National Institutes of Health, and we're grateful for recent increased investment by the NIH and CDC in firearm injury prevention. These and more investments are needed because the United States is unquestionably facing a public health crisis as it relates to firearm violence. Firearms are the leading cause of death among high school age children. This is not a problem isolated to any single community. Every child and adolescent from both urban and rural areas are equally affected by this public health crisis. In fact, here in Michigan, more people die as a result of firearm injuries than from motor vehicle accidents. We also know that COVID-19 has increased mental health challenges in our society, with feelings of isolation and depression exacerbated by the pandemic. And as we see in public health crises, the centuries-long affliction of systemic racism has produced tragic inequities. Firearms are the #1 cause of death for young Black men. Rates for firearm injuries for Black children and teens are more than 3.5 times higher than those among white children and teens. We too often hear the phrase unspeakable tragedies when hearing about Americans killed by gun violence or suicide. But I believe that the knowledge you are generating by examining data-driven solutions will speak loudly to the people of our nation. Through science, we can bring a clarity that hasn't been possible before. And if we give researchers the right opportunities, we can begin to solve this crisis. I'm proud that so many of you have answered this call, including our own researchers here at the U of M. Last year at Michigan, we were proud to launch a campus-wide firearm injury prevention research initiative to develop new knowledge and data on firearm violence. Through the initiative, we're seeking to engage the breadth of expertise across the university with input from non-academic stakeholders to generate knowledge and advance solutions that will decrease firearm injury in the United States. We wanted to give researchers like you the opportunity to pursue knowledge that can produce life-saving solutions for our society. When Dr. Cunningham told me that the FACTS Consortium had organized a whole day of abstracts and data on the topic, I realized why I am an optimist. It's the scientist in me. I believe that there are answers to even the most complex problems, just waiting to be discovered. Thank you for your commitment to addressing this crisis, and I wish everybody a great day and a productive symposium. Thank you.
Thank you for that, President Schlissel. The leadership of the university is noted and really critical, both for us here to see as well as for our young scholars to understand the importance and the credibility of the field and the ability to work in this field for an entire career. I would now like to introduce Dr. DuBois Bowman, Dean of the University of Michigan School of Public Health. Dean Bowman has championed firearm injury prevention in the School of Public Health, as well as the role of public health in addressing racial disparities. Today, Dean Bowman will discuss the public health perspective on disparities and firearms among children and teens. If you could please share his slides.
Good morning, and thank you for the introduction, Rebecca. It's my pleasure to be able to join the meeting this morning. And it brings back fond memories of joining the FACTS Symposium last year and reflections upon what a year we've had since that time. The pandemic has significantly raised the profile of public health. If you'll advance to the next slide. While public health is currently in the spotlight, or depending on how you look at it, perhaps in the hot seat because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and racism has been recognized and viewed as a public health problem, certainly another very important function of public health is injury reduction. And in fact, public health innovation and interventions have driven changes for safer car seats, safer bike helmets, child-proof caps on medications, regulations on cigarette advertising, just to name a few. And undoubtedly, these interventions have saved countless lives. And we continue to assess how to decrease injuries with the greatest public health impact. Next slide. One of the most pressing public health challenges of our time is preventing child and adolescent firearm injury and death. And this is especially true in the United States. 8 children and adolescents die from firearm injuries every day in the United States. And firearm deaths in American youth account for more than 90% of total childhood firearm deaths across the world. And keep in mind that as a country, we represent about 5%, less than 5% of the world's population, even less, closer to 3.5% of the world's children. And so this is a staggering, disproportionate burden that we experience in the United States. Next slide. A comparative assessment underscores the extent of the issue. From 2008 to 2017, motor vehicle crashes were the leading cause of death in the United States, and firearm injuries were represented the second leading cause. Next slide. And if we think about fatalities and look at trends over time in the US, we see that enormous progress has been made in the reduction of motor vehicle fatalities, but we have not seen corresponding progress in reducing firearm deaths. And the rates are actually on the rise again. Next slide. Data also tell us that the cause of firearm death varies by age group. The most common mechanism for adult firearm deaths is suicide, representing about 2/3 of the total. a different picture emerges when you consider youth, where homicides account for 62% of the total firearm deaths. Next slide. The mechanisms of youth firearm deaths also vary considerably by setting, while children and adolescents are dying at about the same rates from firearm injury preventions or injuries on a whole. If we think about urban and rural communities, the firearm suicide rate was over 2 times higher among rural youth relative to urban youth. And then conversely, the homicide rate was 2.3 times higher among urban youth compared to rural youth. So suicide more common for rural, and homicide more common for urban. Next slide. We also see clear racial ethnic disparities in youth firearm injuries. This was alluded to by President Schlissel and Dr. Cunningham, and I know it'll be a central theme throughout today's meeting. Firearm injuries have been the leading cause of death for African American youth for well over a decade, and no progress has been made in addressing this disparity. Black youth are 14.5 times more likely than white youth to die by homicide, 14.5 times more. While homicide is higher among Black Americans, suicide disproportionately affects white and Native American youth. And yet suicide rates among African Americans has increased substantially in recent years, narrowing the gap. We usually want narrowing of gaps to be by public health progress rather than the increasing rates that we've observed here. And just as we've seen health disparities among COVID-19, these disparities in firearm fatalities and many other aspects of public health really reflect the roots of structural inequality and racism. Next slide. The fatality rate from police killings of Black Americans and Native Americans is more than twice that for white Americans. The risk of being killed by police use of force is highest specifically for Black men. I know again that this topic is going to be covered in detail later in the program. Police killings of unarmed Black Americans also has secondary and tertiary effects that are deleterious, including impacts on mental health. And so addressing structural racism is, in my mind, foundational to preventing youth firearm injury and eliminating these disparities. Next slide. There's also significant societal cost. Firearm injury costs the U.S. around $229 billion annually. And as we think about, the cost of foreign aid or what we spend on Medicaid, just for references, it paints a picture of the significant impact and societal burden of firearm injuries. Next slide. This table tells a story of its own. Despite the significant public health impact of firearm injuries, there has been insufficient funding to spur research on this topic. And Dr. Cunningham pointed out some recent progress, and I'm very, 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 very encouraged by recent CDC and NIH calls for firearm research and these recent significant investments, but it's clear that much more needs to be done. With significant expertise and an institutional commitment to addressing the issue of gun violence, the University of Michigan and the School of Public Health are poised to make significant strides in addressing this public health crisis. Next slide. I was fortunate as a as a new dean, now a couple of years in, to join a school that consistently does very well year over year in generating sponsored research in a wide range of disciplines. And you know, this funding plays such a critical role in allowing the school to have a positive impact in public health in various communities. Next slide. We have significant expertise in firearm injury prevention. Dr. Cunningham, whose research has been cited throughout my slides, Dr. Mark Zimmerman, who leads the Michigan Youth Violence Prevention Center, and many other faculty. Dr. Zimmerman is one of the top researchers in the School of Public Health with the current research portfolio that ranks among the highest in the school. And a noteworthy recent development in our research portfolio was a $6 million multidisciplinary, multi-institutional national research and training center on school safety funded by the U.S. Department of Justice. Next slide. The University of Michigan School of Public Health has identified gun violence and firearm injury prevention as one of 4 school-wide research priorities for which we will make investment and pursue innovative interdisciplinary research. The other 4 themes shown on this slide obviously reflect the interplay and interactions between the topics, and as noted in my remarks, and as apparent even in the program for today's meeting, the topic of racial disparities permeates all of the other school-wide priority areas for the school, and will continue to be a central focus of our efforts. So next slide, and I'd like to just finish up by thanking all of you, the participants in today's meeting, for dedicating your efforts to tackling this really significant and vexing public health issue. And I'm confident that with your devoted attention, your efforts, and with the appropriate resources, that tremendous progress lies ahead in reducing the impact of firearm deaths, just as we have made significant strides in other areas of public health. So I really, really thank you, appreciate and thank you for your efforts. Back to you, Dr. Cunningham.
Thank you, Dean Bowman, for those fabulous remarks, as well as for your interest and investment and commitment to the University of Michigan School of Public Health efforts in this regard. Again, our leadership's efforts and public efforts in this manner, I think, are really critical to our trainees that are watching this across the country, and that see that this is indeed a great place to focus a career with so much work to be done. I would now like to introduce Dr. Charlie Branas, a professor and chair of epidemiology at the Bowman School of Public Health at Columbia University. Dr. Branas has an extensive background in conducting research that examines an array of risk factors for firearm-related injuries among children, both at the individual and community level. Indeed, he's been working on this topic far more before many of us had turned our attention to it. Much of this research has focused on place-based, spatially oriented risk factors for firearm carriage and the use among children and youth populations. Today, Dr. Branas will discuss beyond tolerance, making the most of a new era of gun violence prevention science. What is next after this? Dr. Branas, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I just want to say really major thanks to President Schlissel and Dean Bowman. This top university leadership, their important comments and recognition of gun violence as a public health crisis are simply key. I was very pleased to see that it's been elevated to one of 4 topics in the School of Public Health at Michigan. I also want to say thanks, of course, to Dr. Rebecca Cunningham, Dr. Mark Zimmerman, and Dr. Patrick Carter for their leadership of what is a historic NIH-funded this FACTS consortium, as well as to the wonderful FACTS staff, especially Lynn Massey, who organized this, and to really to the teams of researchers and community members from the many universities that make up the consortium with whom I've had the honor of working this past year. To say that we're in a new era would be an understatement. I am talking, of course, about the pandemic and the long overdue actions in response to the toxic legacy of racism in the US. But I'm also talking about the long overdue recognition of the life-saving need for scientific study and prevention of gun violence. Foundations and donors that had never invested in gun violence prevention science are doing so now like never before. And the US government is putting forward tens of millions of federal dollars. Can I have the first slide, please? Tens of millions of federal dollars specifically for gun violence prevention research, not as a sidebar to other calls for research, but as standalone direct calls for gun violence research at agencies like the NIH and the CDC. As you can see here, these were the past announcements earlier this year. In fact, the CDC have publicly announced that, quote, research on all forms of firearm-related violence is critically important. And the NIH have now publicly stated that scientific research is critical to understanding and preventing firearm violence. Wow, impressive. I mean, this doesn't sound like agencies that were, for all intents and purposes, prohibited from conducting gun violence research just a year ago. So we've gone beyond simply a reluctant tolerance of gun violence research to outright encouragement of gun violence research. This is, of course, a welcome 180-degree turn. But what should the gun violence research community do now with this sudden support? An answer, I would say, new. We need new resources, new people, and above all, new ideas. And let me briefly expand on each of these. Can I have the next slide, please? The resources and encouragement that are now moving toward gun violence research are great, but at best, it's a starter kit on the road to real impact. As the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare, guns and gun violence are in no short supply in the United States. Shootings and gun homicides are growing at an alarming rate in many US cities in our high-tension post-pandemic world. And the isolation of the pandemic, combined with record-breaking growth in access to firearms, often now among first-time, completely inexperienced gun owners, is a troubling mix leading down a road to increasing gun suicide, for instance. Even with the new private and federal scientific funding that is now being provided, our investment in gun violence science and prevention remains orders of magnitude below nearly every other leading cause of death, as Dr. Bowman pointed out. And with the increases prompted by the pandemic, this disparity will only get worse. To cut to the chase on my first point, we need even more new resources for gun violence research and prevention. Or as others have pointed out, we need at least one more zero added to the end of the current funding investments to put them on par with other comparable public health problems and the growing gun violence problem that we now face. But to be fair though, I'm still thrilled about the new funding for gun violence research and the scientific legitimacy that's come with it. It's about time. Recently, I had the privilege of serving on both the CDC and the NIH review groups for this new gun violence research funding. I was among dozens of peers who selflessly gave their time and expertise in choosing our first federal investments focused solely on gun violence prevention research in many decades. Together, we reviewed a lot of grant applications. We appropriately triaged out a lot, meaning they will not be funded this round. And we also, as you just heard from Dr. Cunningham, we vigorously debated many high quality grant applications, some of which have been funded or will be funded, and others that hopefully receive useful advice and encouragement and will try again. On the whole, I was overwhelmed by the pent-up interest in terms of the number of scientists that applied, some of whom were new to studying gun violence. This is a very welcome development. And as I looked at the list sent by the Centers for Disease Control this morning, I will note that I recognize some but not most of the names on the list. And I think that that's wonderful. And also, I think it's important to recognize in the applications that were put forward, the creativity of the study ideas that were being proposed. So this brings me to my next point. We need new people. Besides the few dozen or so scientific stalwarts that have been, dare I say, courageously carrying on gun violence research behind the scenes these past decades. And by new, I mean new young scientists to bring their energy and enthusiasm to growing the field of gun violence research and helping us rebound from a lost, what really is a lost generation of gun violence researchers. But I also mean senior scientists who may be from other fields that can lend their expertise, deep experience, and new thinking to the field of gun violence research. And wherever possible, we need scientists from the communities that have been most affected by gun violence. So I'm hoping that this is a bit of a call to action and that you get out there and apply for what will likely be even more funds that will be emerging. It's very, very exciting. But also, I want to encourage the gun violence researchers that are here today to think about bringing along a friend from some other scientific field who wants to make a difference, but has yet to focus on gun violence. Maybe someone from physics or engineering, maybe from history, or maybe Africana or Latin American studies. Let them know that their brand of scholarship is welcome in the effort to prevent gun violence. And this brings me to my last point. We absolutely need new ideas to balance out and expand the outsized work that's been done by a dedicated few for far too long. I think if you ask the average person on the street how to prevent gun violence, they will very likely say one of two things: that we need more laws or we need more law enforcement. While these are both indeed serviceable and sometimes effective ways to prevent and respond to gun violence research itself has largely mirrored the public's idea of what it should be and focused heavily, perhaps too heavily in my estimation, on laws and law enforcement. We need to strike a better balance. Serious and immediate consideration needs to be given to rapidly expanding the study and implementation of other viable options, like community-initiated programs, options that do not rely on police or new laws to prevent gun violence. We can't simply wait for legislators and police agencies to come up with new ideas and programs as our primary sources of scientific inspiration in preventing gun violence. Now look, I am not suggesting that we derail important gun policy evaluations, but I am suggesting that we bring more variety and balance to the nation's gun violence research portfolio and embrace the unique role of discovery that we as scientists and our community partners can offer to society. Scientists are uniquely positioned to discover new, potentially transformative programs that work in our communities and with our communities, and to change the very structures that led to gun violence in the first place. Now, there are multiple community-based and hospital-based gun violence prevention programs that do not involve new gun laws or policing and have been shown to be effective already at the highest levels of scientific evidence. One recent review of US cities indeed showed that nonprofit community building programs cumulatively produced significant reductions in gun violence, and we need more of this. Can I have the beginning of the next slide, please, Lisa? Yes, thank you. So one nice example of this that I like is the Operation Peacemaker Fellowship in Richmond, California. This fellowship, this program uniquely invites individuals who have been previously involved in gun violence to participate in an 18-month internship in the mayor's office. And I know it turned a lot of heads when it started, but that's the kind of disruptive idea that I think we need to begin pursuing more of. So the fellowship includes mentorship. You can see that its tagline is Mentoring Matters, which it does. But it also includes taking individuals in the program to excursions to other cities and giving them stipends of up to $1,000 a month for each of the fellows. And importantly, some recent research has found that this program significantly reduces gun violence in Richmond. There are other programs too that change basic life structures that many of us take for granted. These structures in our communities that many communities don't have, especially historically disinvested communities. Can I have the next portion of this slide? So these historically disinvested communities continue to lack these basic structures, things like new parks and green spaces, or providing emergency financial assistance for home foreclosures. These things at first glance may seem unrelated to gun violence, but it turns out that these inexpensive and structural changes to communities actually have a major impact on gun violence in reducing it. And when communities get together to make new pocket parks or fix abandoned buildings, we now have excellent scientific evidence that these actions significantly reduce gun violence in numerous cities, ranging from cities like Chicago, in Michigan, Detroit, Philadelphia, Youngstown, Flint, the work that's being done at the University of Michigan, Milwaukee, and even New Orleans now, work is being done. So next slide, please. Thanks. So one last program that I like and I want to mention that's under development and shows promise as an example is the Colorado Gun Storage Map. So this, the map, was developed to help community members and gun shop owners quickly identify local options for temporary out-of-home gun storage to help people in crisis. Not only those in crisis, but also those at risk for suicide, or even if a gun owner has their grandkids visiting or is just traveling out of state and wants to keep their weapons secure while they're away. This is a very creative solution that also could potentially save lives. And these are the kind of things that I think we really need to take notice of and begin, again, engineering a better balance of the research, the innovation and the creativity that we're having as gun violence scientists and as a gun violence research community. So what I've shown you today, these are, of course, just a fraction of the community-based gun violence programs out there that are under scientific study or that have already undergone scientific study. Now, ultimately, when you consider that police departments, though, they still account for the largest share of municipal budgets in 35 of our 50 largest US cities. And that, in fact, policing may not always meet expectations in terms of preventing gun violence. And that as we've been learning more and more, not just this past summer, but well before that, that police can indeed manage to undermine the trust of the very communities they are charged to protect. All of this comes together to make other options, like community-based programs, really start to look good as both scalable and high value, high return options to prevent gun violence. It's time we start thinking of these options and these community-based solutions as first choice solutions to gun violence and put the balance of our efforts into their research and development. So I'm just going to close by saying we can do this. We are way out ahead of this, and I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to address you today. We're just now starting to get new resources, and I hope that as these resources grow, a new generation of creative people are going to join us with their exciting new ideas so that we can give the US public the game-changing solutions really that they've so long deserved on gun violence. Thanks again to the outstanding conference organizers and to the president of the university and to Dean Bowman for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you, Dr. Branas. It's such a joy to have you present today with your history and knowledge of this and help us really place our conference today in this moment in time, which has a different momentum than we've had when we've met in past years, where we, in the past, were thinking about how we made this relevant, how we made this credible, and now we have these resources here, and we need to be forward-looking and think about how to best use them. And I love some of the things you say about bring a friend, add a zero. I think both of those are my new favorite quotes. And I think to those of you both here on campus who are thinking about our university initiative as well as across the country, really important comments on engineers, African studies majors, history majors. We need a broad array of scholarship and thinking. And we need our junior and young faculty and students, but we also need our senior scientists who have been looking at areas that are adjacent to this, but not head on, and really have so much context to add from the deep knowledge they have from their fields. And I can't echo those ideas more. And I really also enjoyed the map in Colorado, because I think it's important to reaffirm how much we need our gun ownership and our gun owner population working on this as the most interested group in being part of how we decrease injury in our country and have the most creative ideas often as well. And so really important points to shout out.